Hi there. Let's discuss the difference between a termination and a release. So, a termination form and a release form are both standard forms which can be found in the Zip Forms library, but they serve two different purposes. Now, oftentimes these forms are used in conjunction with each other to terminate a contract and to release all parties from further obligation. But not always will you be using the two forms together. So we're going to discuss that a little later. First, I'd like to go over each of the forms. The termination form is a unilateral form. A unilateral form means that only one party is required to sign the document to make it legally binding. The termination form simply is an instrument allowing one party to put the other party on notice that they are terminating the purchase agreement and they are not moving forward with the transaction. Now, you want to be very careful when using this form because if your client does not have an actual termination right, then it can be very dangerous to file a termination form with the other side of the transaction, and it may cause your client to be in breach of contract. So if you're ever entertaining drawing up a termination form for your client, please call me first so we can discuss whether they legally have the option to terminate or not. Now, a release form is another standard form available in Zip Forms. This is used as a bilateral contract. And what this bilateral agreement does is it requires the signatures of both parties, and both parties agree to release each other from any future obligations or future legal action. It can also serve the purpose of stopping that contract in its tracks. It will not move forward once the release has been signed by both parties. Now, oftentimes the release is also the instrument we use to disperse earnest money deposit. There'll be an indication on the form as to who is being refunded the earnest money deposit. And there are several line options, including the real estate firms. I do not want you to ever list us as a recipient of the earnest money deposit unless you have spoken to me first about it. So the release form can be provided in instances where both parties have agreed to release each other, but neither party actually has a termination right. So sometimes it's perhaps 24 hours after the house has gone under contract, and perhaps the buyer has gotten cold feet, or sometimes the seller has gotten cold feet. And so if both parties have hinted around and said, hey, I think we've made a poor decision, may we be released? They're not putting the other party on notice that they're terminating. Instead, they're politely asking, would you consider releasing us? Sometimes that's with the exchange of earnest money. Sometimes it's not. So the release form does not actually put your client in danger of being in breach of contract if they don't have a termination right, because they're not actually terminating the contract. But I want to be very clear that if your client has requested to be released and the release has not been signed by all parties, then that contract timeline is still carrying on. So unfortunately, if you're representing the buyer and they have cold feet and they ask to be released and the other party says, we'll think about it, send us a release, you can provide that release to them, but please keep in mind that that contract timeline is still moving forward. Your buyer is still under all of the obligations to apply for the loan following the terms that are set in the contract. They're required to be respectful of the inspection timeline. That's still clocking along. So please, if you're ever using a release or a termination form, reach out to me so I can walk you through the process. And I would like to review the contract and make sure that I feel like we have a termination right prior to issuing a termination form. Now, please keep in mind that a termination form is a legally binding document. If you are terminating on behalf of your client and you do not have an actual termination right, that client may come back and look to us to say, why did you give me poor legal advice? And as you know, we are not attorneys. So every time that we have a client who is wanting to terminate a contract or be released from a contract, I always just have a line in the email indicating that it is always my best advice to advise them to reach out for legal counsel to make sure that they are making the choice that is best for them. If they choose not to, that's up to them, but I at least want to make it available to them. So if you have any questions about termination or release, please reach out to me. We do them frequently. And you can get yourself into a little bit of hot water if you are facilitating a termination or a release for our party, for our client, and they don't actually have a valid termination right. All right. Hope you guys have a great day. Thanks.